Picture a quiet night in the countryside, where the stars shine brightly in the dark sky and a soft breeze stirs the dry bushes. In the midst of this calm scene, you can hear the subtle sound of a man working in secret. Hidden from his enemies, Gideon, a simple young man, is threshing wheat in a winepress, a strange and unusual place for such work. The muffled sound of the beating grain echoes, while the fear of being discovered by oppressors hangs in the air. Suddenly, without warning, a divine messenger appears before him. A radiant light breaks through the darkness, and the angel's voice rings out, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." This unexpected encounter is not just a call, but a mission that would turn one of the most unlikely men into the savior of Israel. But what does this have to do with your life? Just as God chose Gideon, he might be calling you to something great, even when you feel small or incapable. Get ready to discover how this story can impact the choices you make today. Gideon was an ordinary man from a small tribe in Israel, the tribe of Manasseh. In fact, he didn't see himself as someone important or strong. When the angel of the Lord appeared to him, calling him a mighty warrior, Gideon was taken aback. He saw himself as the least in his family and his clan as the weakest in Israel, Judges 6 verse 15. But what he didn't realize at that moment was that God often chooses the least likely individuals for his greatest missions. Living in a time when Israel was oppressed by the Midianites, Gideon and his people were in constant fear. The Midianites would raid their crops, leaving the Israelites with little food to survive. Gideon was trying to hide his threshing to keep the grain from being stolen, a reflection of the hopelessness and fear that gripped his people. Yet, this very moment of hiding was when God called him to lead Israel to freedom. Despite his doubts and feelings of inadequacy, Gideon's story shows that God sees beyond human limitations. God doesn't choose people based on their strength or status, but on their willingness to follow his guidance. Gideon's humble beginnings are a reminder that no matter how insignificant we may feel, God has a purpose for everyone. His story challenges us to trust that, like Gideon, we can be called for something much greater than we ever imagined. As Gideon began to realize that God had a specific plan for him, he questioned and asked for signs to confirm his calling. This wasn't out of disbelief, but out of a desire to be sure of God's will. In many ways, this reflects how people often need reassurance when faced with daunting tasks. God, in his patience, provided Gideon with the confirmation he sought, proving that God doesn't get frustrated with our questions but invites us to seek his direction with sincerity. When we look at Gideon's life, we see that God chose him not because of his qualifications but because of his heart. It's a lesson that reminds us how God values faithfulness over outward strength. For anyone who feels unqualified or afraid, Gideon's story is a powerful example of how God can use anyone, no matter their background, to accomplish his purposes. God's choice of Gideon might seem surprising at first glance. After all, Gideon was not a warrior by nature. He wasn't leading armies or known for his bravery. In fact, when God first approached him, he was hiding in a winepress, trying to protect what little he had from the Midianites. But God doesn't choose based on outward appearances or status. He chooses based on the heart, and Gideon's heart, though fearful, was ready to obey. One reason God chose Gideon was to demonstrate that his power is made perfect in weakness. Gideon was fully aware of his limitations. He knew he wasn't the strongest or most influential, and that humility was key. When we recognize our own weaknesses, it opens the door for God to work through us. God wanted to show Israel that the victory wouldn't come from human strength or military strategy, but through his divine intervention. Gideon's story reminds us that God often picks people who least expect to be chosen. The Bible is filled with examples of God choosing the humble and unlikely to accomplish great things. David, the youngest of his brothers, was chosen to be king. Moses, a man who struggled with speaking, was called to lead Israel out of Egypt. God chose Gideon to show that he doesn't rely on human ability, but on his power working through willing vessels. Through Gideon, God was also making a statement to Israel. The Israelites had turned away from God, worshiping other gods, and as a result, they were oppressed by their enemies. God's choice of Gideon, a man who didn't see himself as strong or capable, was a reminder that it's not human might that saves, but faithfulness to God. Gideon's obedience would serve as a testimony to the people of Israel that God is the true deliverer. As we reflect on why God chose Gideon, we see that he was looking for a heart willing to trust and follow him. Gideon's initial hesitation didn't disqualify him from God's plan. In fact, God met Gideon in his doubts and reassured him with signs and confirmations. This shows us that God is patient with our fears and questions, and that he is willing to provide the reassurance we need to step into our calling. Gideon's mission was nothing short of extraordinary. The task ahead of him was daunting: to defeat the Midianites, a powerful enemy that had oppressed Israel for years. The Midianites were described as being like a swarm of locusts in number, so vast that they couldn't be counted. Gideon, with no experience as a military leader and a small army at his disposal, must have felt overwhelmed. Yet God was very clear: Gideon was chosen to lead Israel to victory. One of the most surprising parts of this mission was God's command to reduce Gideon's already small army. Initially, Gideon gathered 32,000 men, but God told him it was too many. God didn't want Israel to think they had won the battle by their own strength. After a series of tests, Gideon's army was reduced to just 300 men. This small number, compared to the vast Midianite army, seemed impossible to succeed, but God had a plan. With only 300 men, God instructed Gideon to use an unconventional battle strategy. Instead of traditional weapons, Gideon's men were equipped with trumpets, jars, and torches. This strategy made no sense from a human perspective, but it was precisely what God intended. The element of surprise and the confusion among the Midianites would turn the tide of the battle in Israel's favor. Gideon's obedience to this strange plan showed his trust in God's wisdom, even when it didn't make sense. Gideon's mission wasn't just about military victory. It was about restoring faith in God's power. Israel had been worshiping false gods and had forgotten the Lord's might. Through Gideon's improbable victory, God was demonstrating to his people that he was still in control, that he alone could deliver them from their enemies. Gideon became a living example of how God uses the weak to shame the strong and the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. 1 Corinthians 1 verse 27. The incredible mission given to Gideon also teaches us something about stepping into our own callings. Often, God asks us to take on tasks that feel far beyond our abilities. But just like Gideon, we are reminded that success doesn't depend on our strength but on God's. The story challenges us to embrace the missions God places in front of us, knowing that even when we feel inadequate, he equips us with everything we need to succeed. Despite being chosen by God for such an important mission, Gideon was plagued by doubts. He struggled to believe that he was the right person for the job. After all, he considered himself the least of the least, coming from a weak clan and a family with no prominence. When God called him to lead Israel, Gideon's immediate response was to question the choice. But instead of rebuking him, God patiently reassured him. One of the key moments that demonstrates Gideon's doubts was his request for signs. Gideon asked God to confirm his will not once, but twice, through a miraculous sign with a fleece of wool, Judges 6 verses 36 to 40. He asked that the fleece be wet with dew while the ground remained dry, and the next night the reverse. God, understanding Gideon's uncertainty, graciously provided the signs exactly as Gideon had requested. This shows us that God doesn't get frustrated when we ask for reassurance. Instead, he meets us where we are. Gideon's doubts were not an indication of disbelief, but rather a desire to be sure that he was following God's will. In many ways, his hesitation resonates with those of us who have ever felt unsure about stepping into something big. Sometimes, it's not that we lack faith in God, but that we are uncertain about our own ability to fulfill what he is asking of us. Gideon's story reminds us that it's okay to seek confirmation, as long as we remain open to God's direction. Throughout Gideon's journey, God continued to demonstrate patience and encouragement. He knew that Gideon's heart was willing, but his mind needed assurance. Before the battle against the Midianites, God gave Gideon one final sign of confirmation. He told Gideon to sneak into the enemy's camp and listen to what the Midianites were saying. There, Gideon overheard a dream that one of the enemy soldiers had, which foretold Israel's victory. This final sign strengthened Gideon's resolve. God's patience with Gideon shows us something profound about his character. He doesn't demand blind obedience without understanding our human frailties. Instead, he works with us, encouraging us when we are afraid and giving us the confidence to step into his plans. Gideon's doubts were not the end of his calling, but rather a step in the process of him becoming the leader God intended him to be. When the time came for Gideon to lead his army into battle, everything seemed stacked against them. With only 300 men, facing an army as numerous as locusts, Gideon was undoubtedly outnumbered and outmatched. But this was precisely the kind of scenario where God's power would shine the brightest. God had deliberately reduced Gideon's forces to ensure that when the victory came, Israel would know it was by God's hand and not their own strength. The battle plan was unconventional, to say the least. Armed with trumpets, jars, and torches, Gideon's men didn't have the usual tools of warfare. But what they lacked in traditional weapons, they made up for with the element of surprise. Under the cover of darkness, Gideon divided his men into 3 groups, surrounding the Midianite camp. At Gideon's signal, the men blew their trumpets, shattered their jars, and raised their torches high, creating chaos and confusion among the enemy. The sudden noise and the sight of flames surrounding them in the dead of night threw the Midianites into panic. Believing they were under attack by a much larger force, they turned on one another in the confusion. By the time the dust settled, the Midianites had been defeated, and Gideon's small force had secured an overwhelming victory. This miraculous outcome was a testament to God's power working through Gideon's obedience, despite the odds being stacked against them. This victory over the Midianites wasn't just a military triumph. It was a spiritual one as well. It showed the people of Israel that God was still with them, even after years of oppression and turning away from him. Through Gideon, God reminded his people that when they rely on him, no enemy is too great to overcome. The battle served as a turning point, where Israel could once again see that their strength came from the Lord, not from their own abilities. Gideon's victory also carries a timeless lesson for us today. There will be moments in life when the challenges ahead seem insurmountable, when we feel outnumbered or outmatched. But just like Gideon, we are reminded that God is able to turn even the most impossible situations around. What matters is not the size of our resources, but the size of our faith in the one who fights our battles for us. After the stunning victory over the Midianites, Gideon's leadership gained newfound recognition among the people of Israel. They saw him not only as the man who led them to freedom, but also as someone chosen by God to deliver their nation from oppression. As a result, the Israelites approached Gideon with an unusual request. They wanted him to become their king. However, Gideon's response revealed his humility and understanding of God's sovereignty. Gideon refused their offer to be crowned king. Instead, he made it clear that it was the Lord who should rule over Israel. Gideon understood that the victory belonged to God, not to him. His refusal to take credit or seek personal power showed his deep reliance on God's authority. This moment reflects a key aspect of godly leadership, understanding that true power and victory come from following God's will, not from pursuing personal glory or status. Despite this, Gideon made a decision that would later have unintended consequences. He asked for a portion of the gold captured from the Midianites and used it to create an ephod, a sacred garment typically worn by priests. Unfortunately, this ephod became a snare for the people, leading them into idolatry. What began as a symbol of victory and gratitude to God eventually turned into an object of worship, drawing the Israelites away from their devotion to the Lord. This part of Gideon's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of good intentions gone wrong. Even though Gideon had led Israel to a great victory, his actions in creating the ephod caused spiritual confusion among the people. It reminds us that even leaders chosen by God can make mistakes, and it highlights the importance of staying vigilant against anything that might draw us away from true worship. In the years that followed, Israel experienced peace under Gideon's leadership. The Midianites no longer posed a threat, and the land rested for 40 years, Judges 8 verse 28. However, Gideon's story also serves as a reminder that leadership comes with great responsibility. While he did many things right, His later actions showed how even a small misstep could have lasting spiritual repercussions for the people he led. One of the most important aspects of Gideon's story is how it highlights the test of true leadership. Gideon was not a king, nor did he desire to be. However, the people of Israel saw him as a powerful figure after his victory against the Midianites. In this way, Gideon's leadership was not just about military success. It was about how he handled the influence and authority given to him by God and the people. True leadership, as demonstrated by Gideon, involves humility and the ability to recognize the source of one's success. Gideon knew that the victory was not his but God's. By refusing the crown, he showed a deeper understanding of the role of a leader under God's authority. He could have easily allowed the people to elevate him to a position of ultimate power, but he resisted that temptation, pointing them back to God. However, leadership also comes with tests, and Gideon faced a significant one with the creation of the ephod. Initially, his desire was to honor God, but the unintended consequences of that decision reveal the complexity of leadership. Gideon's mistake was not in his desire to commemorate the victory, but in not foreseeing how easily the people could be led astray. This serves as a reminder that leaders must always be cautious about the example they set, as even well-meaning actions can lead others away from the truth. Another test Gideon faced was maintaining the people's faithfulness to God after the battle. While he led Israel to victory, he was unable to fully steer the nation away from its inclination toward idolatry. The people's hearts still wavered, and they quickly fell back into their old patterns of worshiping false gods after Gideon's death. This points to a deeper challenge within leadership. While one can lead others to victory, it's much harder to maintain their devotion over time. Through Gideon's leadership journey, we see that true leadership is not just about leading in the good times, but also about how one handles influence, power, and the inevitable challenges that arise. Gideon's story invites us to reflect on our own roles as leaders, whether in our families, communities, or workplaces, and to consider how we can lead with integrity, humility, and a constant focus on God's will, even when the test of leadership comes. Gideon's legacy is one deeply rooted in faith, despite his early doubts and hesitations. His story is a powerful example of how God can use even those who feel unqualified or insignificant to accomplish his purposes. Gideon didn't start as a confident leader. He was hiding from his enemies, questioning God's choice, and seeking multiple signs for confirmation. But in the end, it was his faith that defined his legacy, not his initial fears. One of the key aspects of Gideon's legacy is his transformation from a man of fear to a man of faith. When we first meet Gideon, he is hiding in a winepress, afraid of the Midianites. By the end of his story, we see a man who confidently leads 300 men into battle, trusting in God's unconventional plan. This transformation wasn't immediate, but it was the result of Gideon learning to trust God step by step. His journey is a reminder that faith often grows in the process of obedience. Gideon's faith was not only important for his personal story, but also for the nation of Israel. Through his obedience, the Israelites were delivered from years of oppression. His faith didn't just impact him, it changed the course of an entire nation. This shows us that when we step out in faith, our actions can have ripple effects far beyond our own lives. What God does through us can inspire and impact those around us in ways we might never fully understand. However, Gideon's legacy is also a reminder of the importance of staying faithful to God's commands. While Gideon is remembered as a hero of faith, his later decision to create the ephod became a stumbling block for the people of Israel. Even great leaders can make mistakes, and those mistakes can have lasting consequences. It's a lesson in the importance of finishing well, not just starting strong, when it comes to faith and leadership. Ultimately, Gideon's faith is celebrated in the New Testament as well. In Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith, Gideon is listed among the heroes of faith who trusted God and saw miraculous results. His inclusion in this list underscores the importance of faith in overcoming challenges and fulfilling God's purposes. Gideon's legacy, then, is one of faith in God's power, a legacy that continues to inspire believers today. The story of Gideon holds timeless lessons that are just as relevant today as they were in his time. One of the primary lessons is that God doesn't always choose the most obvious candidates for his work. Gideon saw himself as weak and insignificant, but God saw his potential and faith. This teaches us that no matter how small or inadequate we may feel, God can use anyone for his purposes. It's a reminder that our limitations don't disqualify us from being used by God. In fact, they might be exactly what makes us the perfect candidate. Another valuable lesson from Gideon's story is about trusting in God's plans, even when they don't make sense from a human perspective. Gideon's army was reduced to a mere 300 men to face an enormous enemy. From a strategic viewpoint, this seemed like a recipe for disaster. But God had a purpose in this. It was to show that victory comes from Him, not from human strength. In our lives today, we often face situations that seem impossible. Gideon's story encourages us to trust God, even when the odds are stacked against us. Gideon also teaches us about the importance of obedience. God gave him specific instructions on how to defeat the Midianites, and Gideon followed them exactly, even though the plan was unconventional. His obedience led to a miraculous victory. This lesson speaks to the importance of listening to God's voice in our own lives. Sometimes, God asks us to do things that don't make sense at first, but obedience always leads to His greater purpose being fulfilled. Another important takeaway from Gideon's story is about the danger of complacency. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon's actions with the ephod led the people astray. It serves as a warning that even after great victories, we need to stay vigilant in our faith. The challenges don't end with one success. In fact, maintaining our faithfulness to God can be even harder after a big victory. Gideon's story reminds us to stay focused on God, even when we've experienced breakthroughs. Finally, Gideon's journey shows us that it's okay to have doubts. He was honest with God about his fears and uncertainties, and God patiently reassured him. In the same way, we can bring our doubts and fears to God, knowing that He understands and is willing to guide us. Gideon's story is one of faith, but it's also one of grace, God's grace in helping us grow into the people He has called us to be. Gideon's legacy is one of both triumph and caution. His story, from being called in fear to leading a nation to victory, reminds us that God can do extraordinary things through ordinary people. Gideon's willingness to step into his calling, despite his doubts, is a powerful testament to how God sees beyond our limitations. For those of us who feel inadequate or unsure of our purpose, Gideon's story serves as a reminder that God's plans are far bigger than our self-perception. At the heart of Gideon's legacy is the lesson that faith is not about being fearless, but about trusting God even when we are afraid. Gideon's faith grew as he walked with God through each step of his journey. He didn't start out as a mighty warrior, but by the time he led his 300 men to victory, he had learned to fully rely on God's strength. For us, this shows that faith is a process, one that is built through obedience, experience, and God's reassurance. However, Gideon's legacy also comes with a warning. His decision to create the ephod, though initially meant as a tribute to God, ended up leading Israel into idolatry. This part of his story serves as a reminder that even the best intentions can have negative consequences if we're not careful. It's a call to remain focused on God's commands and to avoid allowing our victories or achievements to become distractions from true worship. For us today, Gideon's life is an encouragement to step out in faith, but also a caution to remain humble and vigilant. It's easy to become complacent after a great victory, but Gideon's story teaches us that our faith journey doesn't end after one success. We are called to continue following God closely, recognizing that He is the source of every victory and keeping our eyes on Him as we move forward. In the end, Gideon's legacy is about transformation. He went from hiding in fear to leading in faith, and his story shows us that God can take our weaknesses and turn them into strengths. For anyone wondering if they're capable of answering God's call, Gideon's life is proof that it's not about where you start, but how you allow God to shape you along the way. Gideon's story is more than just an account of a battle won. It's a powerful reminder of how God works through people who are willing to trust Him, even when they feel unqualified. As you reflect on Gideon's journey, what mission is God calling you to today? It might not seem as dramatic as leading an army, but every calling has a purpose. Perhaps God is asking you to step out in faith in a relationship, a career, or even in your spiritual growth. Are you willing to trust Him, even when it doesn't make sense? Think about the moments in your life when you felt like Gideon, unsure, hiding, maybe even doubting your abilities. What could change if you trusted God with those insecurities? Gideon shows us that true strength comes from reliance on God, not on ourselves. So what will you do with that truth? Will you embrace the mission God has for you, knowing that He equips those He calls? As you reflect on this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more lessons like this. Every week, we dive deep into the Bible, learning how its truths can transform our lives. And before we close, let's pray. Lord, thank you for the story of Gideon and how it teaches us to trust you, even in the face of fear and doubt. We ask for your strength in our lives, just as you gave Gideon strength to face the challenges before him. Help us to remember that you see us for more than we are, and that you call us to great things, even when we feel small. Give us the faith to follow you, to listen to your voice, and to trust in your plans. In Jesus' name, Amen.